So we are very happy to welcome you to this seminar today that is a joint venture between the Nobel Prize Museum and the SNS, which we are very happy to have this nice collaboration with. And fighting poverty, building a green future, and exploring our universe. Rarely has the Nobel Prize shown that the benefit of science is making the benefit for humankind in so many levels. And this week we have celebrated what science have achieved for humankind, and we have celebrated the 2019 year's laureates whom has contributed to make the world such a nice place. On Tuesday, the laureates received the Nobel Prize in the concert hall, and the past week has been full of activities for the laureates. And today we are extremely happy that we have Professor Michael Kremer, who was awarded the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economical Sciences in Memory of Alfred Nobel 2019, and very honored that you took the time to come here today and talk about your work for us. And I would just like to say thank you so much again to Mia and to SNS for having this lovely collaboration. And I hand over to you.
Thank you, Anna. And a very warm welcome also from me, and also to say that it's an enormous big honor to have Professor Kremer here. And we are very much also looking forward to this seminar. And we're happy to be able to work together with you, the Nobel Prize Museum, and also to have this seminar as part of the seminar series that we have with the Institute for International Economic Studies in IIES, SNS, International Policy Talks. The research conducted by this year's laureates in economic sciences, Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael Kremer, has already helped to alleviate poverty. And also their new experiment-based approach has transformed the field of development economics. A Swedish researcher active in the field, Martina Björkman Nyqvist, Associate Professor at Stockholm School of Economics, will moderate our seminar. And Martina will also, after the presentation of Michael Kremer, present a short summary of one of her studies based on this new experiment-based approach before you open up for Q&As. So we leave the floor to you, Martina. Welcome.
So hi everyone, I'm very pleased to be here with Michael. So I would like to just very briefly tell you a little bit about the prize, this year's Economic Science Prize. So they were awarded the prize for the introduction of the experimental approach into development economics as a tool to understand how to fight global poverty with scientific evidence. The question, the method that they used, randomized controlled trials, is the method that they're awarded for. This method let us look at the big question on how to tackle global poverty by dividing it into smaller questions. Questions that are smaller, and therefore they're more concise and more precise, and they're therefore a bit easier to understand and to tackle. But they all together work towards fighting global poverty. As Mia said, this work has transformed the field of development economics in just 2 decades, and moreover, it has influenced policy massively. Today, more than 300 million kids are receiving deworming pills because of Michael's work, together with Ted Miguel. And Abhijit and Esther, the very early work on teaching at the right levels, teaching kids at the right level in schools in India, are reaching more than 60 million kids today in more than 11 countries. So this prize in economics has already had a massive policy impact. So it's with great honor and pleasure that I introduce you all to Michael Kremer, who today will join us and talk about the research behind the prize and some policy implication. So I give the floor to Michael for the next 25 minutes.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Today I'd like to talk about the experimental approach to addressing poverty, and which was recognized by the prize, which I'd like to try to show you today that this approach can be useful for three purposes. The first is in advancing science. The second can be useful in terms of the policy implications for informing policymakers to address problems of poverty. And then the third is something that may be a little bit less familiar as a role for economists, which is it can be useful as a tool for innovation. I'd like to make a bit of an analogy to other fields. You know, if you think about other fields, for example, biology, we think that it's normal that in addition to trying to understand the fundamentals of how cells work and how DNA is structured, that biologists would also be working on very specific practical problems to try to address immediate human needs. And we think that there's a positive feedback loop between addressing those practical problems and advancing the fundamental science. And what I'll try to argue is that economics may now be reaching a similar stage in which there can be a similar positive feedback loop. Okay. So I'll start out by discussing what I see as key features of the experimental approach. Then I'll try to give some examples to make that a bit more concrete. And then finally, I'd like to talk about the role of institutions to encourage innovation and argue that those play a really critical role, and that we should be thinking not just about specific innovations, but we should be thinking about what I'll call meta-innovations, which is new ways to structure the institutions that society has to encourage innovation, both to accelerate the speed of technological and scientific progress, but also to shape them so they better match human needs. So let me start with what I would see as 5 key features of the experimental approach. And let me note that really my understanding of the experimental approach has really evolved considerably since I first started conducting randomized trials. You know, when I started getting involved in this approach in 1994, and you know, at that point, as I'll explain more later, I met somebody from an NGO and was talking to them and sort of suggested this as a potential way to evaluate their programs, and was really focused on this as a tool to get at causal impact. And I'll explain what I mean by that later, but the basic idea is to separate out just correlations that you might observe in the data. Maybe, for example, people who who get more expensive medical care, maybe get better health outcomes or worse health outcomes from something that's truly a causal impact. I think, as I say, I'll explain that more later, giving some examples. But I now think that that's just one of several elements. But I do think that this is a powerful tool, because what field experiments have shown repeatedly is that policies have very different effects than we used to believe by just looking at the correlations in the data and not trying to get at causality. But over the course of many experiments, I realized that conducting field experiments was really more fundamentally changing how economists work. And that ironically, some of the very constraints imposed by experiments actually wind up opening up new opportunities by forcing us to work in new ways. So in particular, I'd argue that the time that we spend in the field as a result of doing these experiments provides a much richer sense of context. Economists typically used to work by taking a data set that perhaps they had no role, typically they had no role in collecting. So they just would download data from the web, from a survey of a population or from a survey of firms, and then they would look for correlations in that data. But the experimental approach requires researchers to spend time in the field, talking to farmers, to teachers, to students, to small business owners, whatever population they're working with. And that gives a much richer, a much deeper sense of context. And that's useful in that's not directly useful in testing hypotheses, but that's useful in generating hypotheses, and as I'll illustrate later. A third element is that experiments are often meant to address very specific practical problems, while also shedding light on larger conceptual questions. Next, experiments are inherently collaborative. They require the researcher to work with governments, with NGOs or civil society, with teams of survey enumerators, and with specialists in other fields, whether that's health, for a health study, or other fields like psychology. And that allows the ideas and experiences of a much broader set of people to enter economics research than had been the case traditionally. The final element that I'd emphasize is that the modern experimental approach is iterative, both within research teams and across research teams. And that's, I think, a key to why this approach has had the impact it has. It enables much more rapid feedback loops. You can get the results of one study, and then instead of waiting for another opportunity to do the follow-up work happening to arise when a new data set's collected that has exactly the right type of data or has exactly the right natural experiment, the right policy change to study something, economists can immediately follow up. Just to give a sense of this, one experiment might test the impacts of a multifaceted program that included many different elements. A second study might seek to understand which components of the multifaceted program actually drive the effects, or might try to test the underlying economic or psychological processes at play that are driving the results. A third might examine if the results could be improved with some minor adjustments or perhaps major adjustments to the program, or if similar results would hold in a somewhat different context. So all of this can be done much more rapidly with experiments than it might be possible otherwise. And I think that's in part because we're often working with NGOs rather than just governments, and NGOs can be much more nimble. And some of this, because we innovated, we're able to conduct these much more cheaply than was possible before, and even with research budgets can do a lot. Of course, large-scale trials done by governments also remain very important. But it's really the accumulation of results from a whole series of experiments that really allow us to learn. We're not really relying on the results of a single trial, but really of the whole tapestry that's been put together. And that's one reason why I think that Abhijit, Esther, and I really want to emphasize that while we're obviously very pleased to receive the prize, this is really recognizing a broader field, and of which hundreds of researchers are involved. But beyond the hundreds of researchers, there's thousands of survey enumerators. There's hundreds or thousands of policymakers in governments or civil society or business who've taken the step, and this is in some cases a brave step, of saying we're going to try to truly understand what the impact is of our work, and we're also going to try to experiment with new approaches to try to learn how to improve it. These 5 characteristics together, I think, are very. Oops, these are not the right slides. Well, I'll do my best. I think these 5 characteristics together can be very useful in making for really 3 purposes, and I would say innovation is the third, even with the fancy colors and chalk. I'm a little bit less demonstrative than this normally. So I think I'll argue first they can be useful for science, and second they can be useful for policy. But third, the reason why this one is highlighted here is because I think they can also be useful for innovation. So let me turn to the examples to be a little bit more concrete. Okay, so. I got involved in this field shortly after finishing my PhD, not because this was the area where I'd been trained. In fact, I was trained in very different type of research. But when I finished my PhD and got my first job, I could afford to travel again and go on a vacation. And before I got my PhD, I had taught secondary school in Kenya, and I went back to Kenya to visit old friends. And one of those friends, someone named Paul Lepea, had been a teacher in Kenya when I taught there, which is how I got to know him. But he had just been hired by an NGO. And this was an NGO that hadn't worked in this region of Kenya before, and was just starting to work there, and was looking for some schools in which to work. And they wanted to find 7 schools where they would begin working. And they had a set of criteria of what type of school they were looking for. But of course there were many, many more schools in Kenya, even in that region of Kenya, that fit their criteria. And he didn't really have a way of deciding between them. And one thing we were talking, and I suggested, well, maybe choose 14 schools and initially introduce the program in 7, and then when you get to the stage where you can expand, maybe you can try the program in the others. But if you just look during the period after you've started the program in 7, but before you've begun it in the others, then you'll be able to assess the impact of the program. It's obviously not a very large sample size, so for those of you who are more technically oriented, there'd be a big margin of error around this, but at least you would start to get some sense of this. And this was just a conversation with a friend while on vacation. But I went back to the US. When I got back to the US, I got a message that he had spoken to his boss about this, and they were actually going to do this. So I then wound up getting involved with them, and initially just helping them evaluate their existing programs, but over time developed a relationship with them and was able to suggest some things that had been found in the literature that they might want to consider. So at that time, there was the literature on the economics of education. There was a debate. Some people thought that it was critical to provide more resources to schools. Other people thought providing more resources won't do that much good. You really need to improve the incentives for teachers and for schools. And the debate was based primarily on correlational evidence. So for example, if in the United States you look, I don't know how it would be in Sweden, but in the United States, if you look across we have quite different spending in different parts of the country on schooling because it's locally financed. And if you just look at the correlation between school spending and how well, and learning levels and test scores, there are all sorts of reasons why that correlation might be misleading for the impact of spending on test scores. So for example, in very depressed parts of the country, maybe it's more expensive to do the teaching because you need more teachers for special needs students. Maybe you need more teaching for people who don't speak English as their first language. You need to hire specialists for that. So you might see that higher spending is associated with worse outcomes, but it might be a mistake to think that that's because the higher spending makes outcomes worse. And you could also think of other reasons why the correlation might go the other way. Maybe in some neighborhoods where the parents care a lot about education, they vote for higher taxes and more spending on education, but and their children do better, but that might not be because of the schools, it might be because of the home environment is also better. So economists would tend to try to come up with different approaches to put in statistical controls. But there's always a million ways that you can do the statistical controls differently. And so, the advocates of more spending can choose one set of statistical controls, the opponents choose another, everybody gets some result that sort of suits their side of the argument. And there was a bit of an impasse in this argument. But there was one thing that actually even the skeptics about spending tended to agree. They were particularly concerned about spending on teachers, hiring more teachers, paying teachers more. They didn't think that would work. But they agreed that in a developing country setting, where many pupils didn't even have textbooks, that providing textbooks would be useful and in fact would be cost effective. Textbooks are very cheap compared to teachers, even in a country like Kenya. So at the time in Kenya, many students didn't have textbooks. And so the NGO decided it would start providing textbooks. And I was involved in an evaluation. This one no longer just seven schools, a somewhat larger sample, although not one that would be particularly exciting by today's standards. And when we looked at the results, I was initially totally shocked, because we didn't see an impact of test scores on average test scores. And you know, this was something that even the skeptics thought that spending on textbooks would make a difference. But I think, like many failures, and I think this is really a common theme in the movement, is that we'll often find real surprises. So things that, things that we quite firmly believed, based in this case on correlational evidence, but also based on common sense, often turn out not to be the case. And I think what's very important. Did I just turn my microphone off? No, it's back. Okay. What's very important is to face those failures, and then to not stop there, but to try to understand what's going on. And for that, the second feature that I mentioned, you know, the identification of causal impact told us there wasn't an effect on average test scores. But it won't tell you why. But then the richer sense of context that you get by spending time in the field doing this, and in my case I'd also been a teacher there, that at least helps suggest hypotheses for why that might be the case. And in this particular case, one thing that's very striking about education in Kenya, but in many developing countries, is that the education system is very focused on the top performing students, on the elites. This was a rural area. Everybody was pretty poor, but the students who were performing best, who tended to be from not the very poorest students, or who were just, for whatever reason, had been able to get to the top of their class. So let me be concrete about that. The language of instruction in Kenya is English. For most pupils in Kenya, English isn't their first language, it's not their second language, it's their third language. So for people to be, in primary school, to be learning in their third language, that's going to be tough in the best of circumstances. But this wasn't the best of circumstances. These kids have malaria all the time, they have worms, their parents have HIV, they have to take care of kids, their teachers are often absent. It's very easy to fall behind the curriculum. The curriculum itself is set to an international standard. It's hard to keep up with that. So the natural hypothesis was, if kids fell sufficiently far behind, that they wouldn't be able to benefit from the textbooks. And we realized we could test that using the data we had. 5 minutes left? Okay. I'm going to have to, I'll only be able to cover some of the ideas here. We could only cover some of those. We could test that hypothesis by looking separately at the kids who scored best at the pre-test level and the kids who didn't score so well. And what we saw was there were strong effects of the textbooks for the kids who scored at the top of the distribution, but not for the other kids in general. So that was a clue that something was going on. But I mentioned that this work is iterative, and I think the next steps were equally important. So Esther and Abhijit and others did a whole series of experiments, then saying, well, what can we do to address this problem now that it's been diagnosed? So let me just take a step just to hit some of the points. I argued these are useful for science. Why are they useful for science? Well, we didn't just learn about textbooks in that particular place. We uncovered what turned out to be a general issue. Economists had been focused on resources versus incentives. This told us there was a whole other dimension of elite orientation of the curriculum that we hadn't been paying attention to, and that was very important. So that's an example of something we learned scientifically and that turned out to be borne out in further studies. But I also argued this was going to be important that this was a source of innovation. And that innovation came in a whole series of experiments done by Esther, by Abhijit, by many others, that developed new approaches for addressing this. It's obviously not politically possible to do a wholesale change in the curriculum for many reasons. But it was possible to provide remedial education, to try other things, or computer-aided instruction to help people catch up. And now we have several techniques for doing that. And that approach, as Martina said, is really affecting millions of kids around the world. Let me just say, a couple of other things, just still sticking to examples. While we found some things were much less effective than we thought, other things were much more effective than we thought. So treating children for worms, for intestinal worms, turned out to have huge impacts on absence from school, and ultimately on learning levels, and ultimately on earnings as adults, because we were able to follow those students later. And we found they earned enough more to pay for the cost of the deworming medicine 100 times over. So that, as Martina noted, that's been scaled up by the Kenyan government, by the Indian government. It's reaching hundreds of millions of kids. There are other examples which I'd be happy to discuss from water, where we've developed new approaches that have been based on the results of these trials. I won't have time really. Maybe we can come back to it of discussing the institutions to support this. But let me just briefly, you can be happy to talk about school-based deworming or water later. Let me just note 3 types of institutions that I think are important. First is this very different type of approach to economics requires a set of institutions to support and facilitate that experimentation. But I think with those institutions in place, we can have a cycle of constant experimentation, refinement, improvement, and then scaling up and further innovation. And that can lead to potentially much faster technological change and growth in this social sphere. Second is we need institutions to fund innovation. Happy to talk about that if people like. And then finally, we need to incentivize the private sector. The private sector right now, they're doing this type of experimentation at very large scale. If you think about firms like Amazon or Google or Facebook, they're constantly trying slight variations of, Amazon will experiment with different prices, different ways of showing you products. They're trying to maximize sales and profits. And, they may be doing a lot of good. I like Amazon, and they may be doing a lot of good for society in the process. But there are other areas where private firms aren't going to put in as many resources, whether that's, for example, finding ways that public schools in Kenya or Tanzania can improve mathematics education. And we need institutions to not only to accelerate innovation, but to try to shape the direction of innovation so that we don't only pursue better ways to sell things on Amazon, but we also pursue better ways to provide education, to provide health, and to find ways to increase incomes for some of the poorest people in the world. So I think that would be the overall message that I would give. I think experiments are one powerful way to do that, and I'd be happy to discuss this more in Q&A later. Thank you.
So thank you, Michael, for this very interesting and inspiring 25 minutes. So what I'm going to do here next, before I'm going to bring Michael up again and we're going to discuss a bit, is to talk about another example of this type of methodology that has been used. So Michael has been talking about experiments in education. This is an experiment in the health sector. And this is a project that I did with Jacob Svensson, who's at IIES at Stockholm University. So this randomized controlled trial and project was focusing on how to reduce HIV rates in a country that was very affected by HIVs. So the motivation behind this, and I don't think I have maybe to say the motivation, but I'm going to do it anyway, is that there is almost 1 million new infections coming every year, adding to the nearly 20 million of people living with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa only. And HIV prevention, therefore, remains as the core of managing this epidemic. And we need to search for innovative programs that reduce sexual risk-taking. So literally, looking for behavioral programs that can change the trend that we see today. So what we did in this project was to think about whether we could use financial incentives as an HIV prevention method. So financial incentives had been used in many other programs, and one very famous program is the Progresa program in Mexico, where they gave conditional cash transfers. So literally they provided money to parents if they sent their kids to schooling. That was actually one of the first big RCTs that governments initiated in Mexico as well. We then thought, maybe we could use something like that. Maybe there's a way that we could, pay people to protect themselves when they have sex. In this project, we then tried to use financial incentives to induce safer sexual behavior, and the ultimate goal, to reduce HIV incidence. We did this in Lesotho. Lesotho is a country where there's roughly 3 million people living, and every fourth person in that country has HIV. It's a country where a drastic change for HIV prevention is needed. So the goal was to reduce the spread of HIV by using lotteries. Why lotteries? Why do you want to use a lottery? Well, there are many reasons. Our initial ideas were that lotteries might attract risk-loving people. Risk-loving people might think that they're going to win the lottery because they're risk lovers. Risk-loving people, we had no clue. But maybe it was the case that they were also more risky when they were having sex. So that was one, and the other one was that it's kind of cheap to use lotteries. You don't have to pay every single person who protect themselves and stay HIV negative. You only pay the winners. So the lottery was the project, it actually should say. So we had nurses that visited all of our villages every fourth month. Every fourth month, they tested the people who were participating in our project for sexually transmitted infections. So the lottery was conditional on not HIV, but on sexually transmitted infections. So gonorrhea and trichomonias and so on. And the reason was that we wanted people to have a chance to learn. So if you were tested negative for an HIV, for STI, sexually transmitted infections, you got a lottery ticket. On Sunday in that village, there was the lottery draw. You had the chance to win 4 to 6 months' salary if you had been tested negatively for sexually transmitted infections. If you were tested positive, you got an antibiotic, and you had a new chance a quarter from now to participate in the lottery. Okay, so this is randomized controlled trials, which these laureates has been awarded the prize for. So you have a set of people. In this case, we had 3,000 volunteer individuals who wanted to participate in this program that were in sexually active age. We randomly decided that 30% of them were in a group that had the chance to win $50, so that's about 4 months' salary in this country. 30% of the group were randomly allocated to be able to participate in the program that had a $100 award. And then we had 40% of the group that were tested and treated if they were found to have sexually transmitted infections, but they did not receive the lottery ticket. All individuals were tested and received counseling and testing every 4th month. Everyone who was tested positive received antibiotics to get treated. If you were tested positive for HIV, you also got referred to the closest medical clinic. This is a winner, a lottery winner in one of our pilot villages. What did we find? After 2 years, we found large reductions in HIV incidence. The lottery program reduced the number of people who had HIV by 21.4% in the treatment groups, the groups that got the lottery, compared to the control group. The largest impact was found among the risk-loving people. So risk-loving people, among that pool of people, HIV was reduced by almost 50%. HIV incidence, I should say, new HIV people getting new HIV. So the lottery seemed to be particularly attractive to change in behavior among risk-loving people. And then we found the impact on other things as well. So to conclude, the UN Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals that we all know about has an ambitious target that wants to eradicate HIV by 2030. That calls for a demand for very cost-effective prevention programs. With this field experiment, whose one field experiment, one trial, we found in this particular setting that lotteries might be a way to change sexual behavior. Lotteries are relatively cost-effective, as I said. You only pay the winners, you don't have to pay everyone. But in order to reach the Sustainable Development Goal by 2030, we need to work even more broadly. So, antiretroviral drugs, how do we make sure that they reach the poor and that they're affordable to the poor? Vaccines for HIV. How is that process going and where are we heading with that? And I'm going to end this very quick case by leaving it there because I'm going to pick up the discussion with Michael on exactly the last point that I have there. So I'm going to welcome Michael up for a moderating session.
Great.
So, as I ended the presentation, we need, in order to eradicate HIV by 2030, but it's not only about HIV. It's only about a lot of other tropical diseases, and it's also about reaching full coverage of immunization for children. We need to work on many dimensions. As an economist, you can do what I done, or what we done. You can work on behavioral changes. But there are other very important dimensions as well that we need to ensure that drugs and vaccines are there. We need to ensure that they reach the poorest part of the world. But we also need to ensure that pharmaceutical firms are investing in these diseases. Diseases that pharmaceutical firms don't find particularly interesting to invest in and do research on. Why is that the case? That's the case because you're not going to earn a lot of money by selling drugs to poor people. So this is something that Michael has worked quite intensely on, and I would like you to tell us a little bit about how should we think about this major problem on incentives to pharmaceutical firms.
Thank you. Yes. So exactly as you say, there's two problems around access to drugs and vaccines. One is one is a problem of incentivizing the research, and the other is the problem of ensuring access. And often these are seen as conflicting with each other. We could have stronger intellectual property rights, stronger patent systems, longer lengths of patents. That might increase incentives to do research, but on the other hand, it might reduce access to people. So and the issue of incentives to do R&D is particularly an issue for diseases that disproportionately affect developing countries, diseases like malaria. And it's arguably a larger issue for vaccines than for drugs. Drugs are often seen as more profitable. So an approach which Rachel Glenister and I suggested in a book called Strong Medicine was something called an advanced market commitment. And this would be a commitment by donors that if the appropriate vaccines are developed, we focused on the case of vaccines, that donors would commit in advance that they would help finance the purchase and pre-commit to a particular price and say if the drug companies, if the pharmaceutical companies, the biotech companies come up with a product that meets the appropriate technical standards, and if they're willing to sell it at that price, then they would help ensure that there would be a market by helping finance the purchase, and thereby that would help address the access problem as well. And so a group of donor countries and the Gates Foundation indeed committed to an advanced market commitment for pneumococcus. So pneumococcus is a disease that exists in different strains. So different countries have different strains of the disease. There were vaccines against the strains that were common in developed countries, but not against the strains common in developing countries. And more than 1 million people were dying each year of this disease. And the donors committed $1.5 billion to help finance purchase of this, should it be developed. Indeed, subsequent to that, 2 companies came up with strains of the vaccine versions with new vaccines that covered the strains that were common in developing countries. And I believe, I don't have my notes with me, but I think more than 200 million people have now been immunized against those. I do think that, so I think this was a success and very important public health benefits, but I also think that the details of how you design programs like this are very important, and I think there's scope to, this was actually called a pilot advanced market commitment, and I think we learned something that there's some proof of concept that this can work, but I also think there's scope to improve and design these better, and I think there are many technological challenges that we need for the developing world, where the developing world has somewhat different needs than the developed world, whether that's in health, whether it's in agriculture, whether there's different crops, different diseases, even in areas like energy and climate change. And I think this general approach of advanced market commitment is something that, along with other ideas, we should be exploring to improve the overall incentive system and try to get the same combination of, public upfront funding for university researchers like us, but complement that with incentives to harness the energy and initiative and resources of the private sector to try so that they're devoting some of that energy to problems affecting some of the world's poorest people.
Thank you. So that's, I think this advanced market commitments is very innovative. I wish there was more, funders who were committing to these advanced market commitments, and especially on diseases, as you said, that we are primarily affecting poor countries, and therefore the incentives are low right now. You also talked a little bit about patent buyouts.
Yes.
Yeah. What is that? And
right.
Can you tell us a little bit about that as an alternative?
Sure. So an alternative, and in fact, I'd earlier done work on patent buyouts, and that was more academic, more theoretical work. So another way to help address the trade-off between incentives and access would be if governments would, once companies had patents, and then they're producing the drugs and maybe selling them at a high price, the governments could say, they could offer to buy out the patent and say, we will buy the patent from you, we'll put the patent in the public domain, and then many companies could try to produce the drug, and then there'd be competition and the price would fall, but that would preserve the incentives for research because the company would be selling the patent voluntarily, they wouldn't be forced to sell, but it would help increase access to the drugs once they were developed. So that's another approach. For various reasons at the time, it seemed like there was more scope politically for the advanced market commitment approach. So I did more work on that, and that's the one that wound up being adopted. But I think both of these approaches and many other approaches are worth exploring. If we can find, we use the patent system, we use research funding for universities, but those aren't the only possible mechanisms that we can use to encourage innovation in society. And I think as a society, economic growth and human progress depends on our environment depends on progress in these areas, and we need to experiment with new tools for encouraging it.
Thank you. So my last questions before I'm going to hand out for some questions from the audience is going to be related to the fact that you have bringing up that you said maybe we can talk institutions later, so
right.
Let's do that. So you are very engaged with large donors to help them create initiatives that moves policy in the right direction, and so is Esther and Abhijit. So could you tell us a little bit about your engagement with the USA Development Innovation Venture and what you do there, and what your motivation for engaging in that is?
Great, thank you very much. So I told you a little bit about the story of deworming and how that, we did some experiments on that, or I don't say we did experiments. The NGO this was an existing policy. The NGO was phasing it up, and we were able to evaluate that. But then we were able to show the results to the Kenyan government. And before I said, the Kenyan government scaled it up, and then the Indian government scaled it up. But there were many steps. The program had to be adapted and changed so that it could be used by a government. There's a ton of work involved, as I'm sure any of you who've worked either in the private sector or public sector would know. And really, to have a system for innovation, we need the ability to pilot new ideas, the ability to rigorously test them to find out what really works and what doesn't, and the ability to then do the work to scale that up. So I had been asked, this was in 2010, I guess, or 2009, I was asked if I wanted to get involved with the U.S. Agency for International Development, and I said I liked my job as a researcher, but I said I thought there was a need for funding streams to support not just the trials of the type we discussed, but the initial piloting, the trials, and then for the most successful innovations, work to try to adapt it so it could actually be scaled. So the U.S. government provided funds to create a funding institution, which, by the way, is open internationally. So people here have ideas, please apply. Called Development Innovation Ventures, and that supports innovations to try to advance issues of innovations intended for the poorest people of the world, either innovations that would scale commercially or new approaches governments could use. We recently, it's open to social entrepreneurs, to for-profit firms, and to researchers, to technologists. We recently went back and evaluated the track record. We went back to our portfolio of the first 43 innovations we funded, 2010 through 12. And the results were very encouraging. We supported 43 innovations during that time. We spent, I think, just $17 million. We were just getting started. When we looked at the benefits, we identified just 4 of those innovations, and we just looked at the benefits of 4 of them. And the benefits of those 4 were more than 5 times as big as the cost of the entire portfolio. So, obviously many of the things didn't succeed, but if, just like any technology investor, if you get a few big hits, that more than pays for the cost of the entire portfolio. So I think the lesson is, 2 lessons. One, you have to take a portfolio approach. But the other lesson is, this is precisely because many of the private sector players are focusing just on a narrow set of things. There's many opportunities out there for public funding to find innovations that can have tremendous benefits to society. And I think there's a role for donors in general, aid donors, to not only address current needs, but try to develop innovative new approaches that can be an investment in the future.
Thank you. So now I'm actually going to open up for some questions from you.
Thank you. My name is Jon Simonsson. I'm heading a government committee. To reach the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to speed up the tempo of technology adoption and also of innovation. And if you look at a public policy on a generic level, how should you say that governments like Sweden should start using experiments and tests on a broad front? There are a lot of political risks, there are media risks, there are a lot of uncertainties around experimentation. Do you have any advice to how to act on a government level to encourage more experimentation and testing?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all of that. How can governments encourage more experimentation?
How should we encourage governments to do more experimentation on programs?
Right. So I think
in a shortcut.
Sorry, what?
In a shortcut. So I mean, that's the question.
Yeah, right. So I think that there's lots of opportunities for governments to try new approaches, and that could range in a wide variety of policies. That could be. I think there's plenty of opportunities in our own societies as well. So the U.S. government, for example, is supporting different approaches to deal with education. We're supporting different approaches to deal with job training for in areas where workers where industries have closed down and workers are looking for new types of jobs. There's a whole there's a whole set of different strategies for retraining workers so they can find new jobs. Or I'll give you another example on savings rates. So, Americans are notorious for low savings rates. Often it's possible, often companies offer quite generous pension plans. They offer to match, if workers will save some of their salary, the companies will match that. But many workers don't take advantage of those. This is just it sounds completely trivial, but one finding was if you just change the nature of those systems so that instead of the worker having to sign up to be included, you set it up so the worker automatically contributes, but if they don't want to contribute, they can just say they don't want to contribute and then they won't. Well, just the switch of what's called the default can have a tremendous impact. I hesitate to even call that an innovation, but it is an innovation. It's just something that people weren't doing before. And I think one of the lessons of these efforts at experimentation and innovation is that, as I said earlier, innovations we've known for a long time that innovations in natural science can be tremendously productive, but social science innovations can also have dramatic impacts on human welfare, whether that's in developing countries or whether that's in industrialized societies.
So we're going to take one more question. So who wants to take the opportunity to ask Michael something?
In 1992, at the time for the Kyoto Protocol, the world population has until now increased with 2.2 billion persons. How do you think that this thing will affect the poverty and the climate?
So the was 1990s 2 billion people in poverty?
2 billion people, and how is that going to affect poverty and
right.
climate?
Well, poverty and climate?
Climate, yeah.
Climate, yeah.
Or maybe you want to stop with poverty, so
okay.
decide, yeah. You don't want to be an environmentalist.
Okay. So there's just been tremendous progress in the world against poverty. So just as an example, over the time since I went to university till now, there's been a 75% reduction in the fraction of the world's population that's living in absolute poverty. That's earning less than $2 a day, and I think that's due to a wide variety of factors. Importantly, improved economic growth in some of the poorest countries in the world. But we've also seen tremendous progress, as Martina's pointed out. We've seen tremendous progress in a wide variety of areas, whether that's health, living, education levels, life expectancy, and that's in part because of a whole series of improvements that we've developed in microeconomic policies, some of which come from experimentation. So I think there's been tremendous progress. I think there's tremendous scope for additional progress. And as I've indicated, while these can be very important as tools against poverty, they can also be important in many other areas, including the fight against climate change.
So me and Michael are going to end it here, and we're going to hand over to Mia to conclude.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Michael and Martina, and also the audience for a very inspiring talk. And I think this is going to continue. I know Martina is going to actually use this thing on I don't know if I can say this, but on a Swedish case. Yes, I can. I did say it too. So I mean, it's a method that can be used, as you have explained and given examples on so many issues. So we're really looking forward to learn more and come back to this type of seminars again. And let me add that if you want more information on the project that Martina described, there are publications, a study that was, or a summary of a study that was made by Martina and Jakob Svensson of the Institute of International Studies out here. They did it for us at SNS. We try to compile these type of important research where we can learn a lot from in short papers, and you find one out there on this study that Martina talked about. So with that, thank you so much for coming, and also for staying on for 5 or 10 extra minutes. Thank you so much.